I'm Josephine, Cloto, Marley, Wilson in parentheses, Beckwith. I'm doing my life sit-in right here. All that people have been doing for so many generations. Like my grandfather Johnson and some of his cohorts of that era, they did what they knew to do. For an instance, because of the situation with their children when they would come from these country areas in Foster Township and Godfrey Township, where they were not segregated. But when they finished, and I'm not sure of the grade, whether it was 6th or whatever, 8th or whatever. But then when those students had to come to town to school, then they had to face segregation and so forth. And so Grandfather Johnson's philosophy seemed to have been, well, if they're going to be segregated, we'll send them to better schools that are segregated. So consequently, many of our foreparents finished high school at Sumner High School in St. Louis and Lincoln High School in East St. Louis, and those schools that at that time were more advanced. And they were more advanced because they really produced some fantastic people. And so what I'm trying to say is that when we speak of the human rights, civil rights era, it didn't just flash up like in 1960. The generations of people have been doing what they found to do, just probably ever since slavery. We talk about the Renaissance. Here in the Middle West, we're not that conscious, but it's great. And it had a great, great influence on our whole American society, literary and social as well. If you know people who talk about things like that, you know what their grandparents experienced and the advances that they tried to bring about, and some politically and some socially and some culturally. So when it came down to, for instance, what I lived through, and I'm very young, married and having children here in this community, and I had come from East St. Louis, where I spent my teen years, my early teen years, because I really was still a 19-year-old teen. That's still a teenager. But I had exposure there. In East St. Louis and St. Louis, I had cultural exposure and literary exposure and so forth that we had not had in Alton. And so I was restless as a parent because my children were not getting that. And so we were running back and forth with kids to St. Louis and East St. Louis to activities and taking them cross country to everything was happening, and all. You had to work so hard at it. So, the schools were segregated. But I think what finally happened, and Tillman, their father, Tillman Wilson, and I would talk about it, and we'd have to pay bus fare, or the kids would have to walk across town, no matter if they came from the Wood Station or from Foster Township or Godfrey Township. If they were black, they went to the Lovejoy Junior High School. So as we had kids going to Dunbar School when they got old enough. I had been active with PTA, though, practically all of my life. Whenever we'd come to Alton, my mother was active in PTA, Cloto May Johnson, Marley Baker, I went to PTA, and I belonged to Dunbar School PTA since I was 16 years old. Every time, because it was my mother's thing, church and PTA was her big thing. And so naturally, when I had children, I was still active helping families with their children at Dunbar School. And then when my children were old enough, that's the school that they went to. And of course, you probably know that with the actual program for desegregation, the black schools were closed, and Dunbar was one of them. But that school was a very outstanding community center. The white children have always had kindergarten in this community, always. Everett and Tillman went to, it was something like Head Start, maybe not as finely tuned. It was Mary McLeod Bethune's program that Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt championed. So it was like, as I said, it was similar to Head Start for kindergarten age kids, but it was not real kindergarten. It was a government program kind of thing, which, so my two older kids went to that. Then my daughter came along, and she was ready for kindergarten. And we were just always so unhappy with all of this special stuff that your kids couldn't just do what's normal, you know. It would just upset Tillman and I. And he was so supportive in that respect, and such an outstanding example of a father who was concerned. And so with Naomi, by that time, I had been president of the PTA for a long time at Dunbar School. And I was the Girl Scout leader. I'd had brownies and Girl Scouts, and all this stuff, you know. And at church, you know, I had Sunday school class, extracurricular programs. So that meant coming in contact with a lot of parents. So the more, and we were privately, Tillman and our family, we were working on most of these areas in our own way. But I mean, we were just into all of that kind of thing, but we really at that point, we weren't sure how to do what we knew had to be done. This group of girls that I was working with, little girls, my daughter Naomi, Joyce Robinson Gill, Joyce Gill at that time, Robinson, and that group of little girls were my brownies, and they were becoming kindergarten age. And I was running all over with the PTA council of all PTAs. I was the secretary for 10 years. I was secretary of the whole PTA council. And we were working on projects for the Alton schools, like building what you know of as the annex. We were traveling and looking at new school buildings and getting ideas and all this. My children could not go to that school, but I was working on the committee. This is what we've lived through, that kind of thing. All right, so now all of these things happen in one's life, and then there comes times and opportunities where you draw a line. Okay, so this kindergarten thing was one time. I was determined that Naomi was going to be able, and her friends would have kindergarten. So I started a PTA effort. I started through the PTA. I thought that would be the easiest way to do it. and it was not really working too good. We had strong backing in some instances from other PTAs, but not as we needed. And the Board of Education was just adamant. And the superintendent of schools, he was a person who wanted to make everybody happy. He knew it was wrong, but he felt he was in a bind. Ewing was his name, and I don't remember his first name. The same thing applied truthfully to all school employees, no matter who they were, what color they were. And that continued, that spirit continued, because they were, unlike, well, people are always afraid of their jobs, but this was really more intense than experienced now. Okay, and so the principal of the school at that time was Miss Daisy Faircox. She was Daisy Long at that time. That was her maiden name. And she was in our corner, but, you know, she was limited. She couldn't do what her heart was telling her to do, because all this pressure was on the teachers and the people. So anyway, the long and short of the story is that in my going to the superintendent and representatives of the school board, and they're saying, well, no, 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 you have to have this, or you have to do a survey of the whole district and find out if, or you have to do that. All they made, and I don't care what they told me had to be done, I did it. And if I couldn't do it, I got somebody who knew how to do it on my own. And so the last straw, everything had met all of their requirements. And the last time, Mr. Ewing says, I'm sorry, Miss Wilson, but we just can't find a qualified, and he's shaking his head like this, we just can't find a qualified Negro teacher. And that was all I needed. I got on the telephone. I called my sister, who was qualified to teach anything that anybody wanted to learn, but she worked for the government. She was not teaching, but she had, you know, her qualifications to teach. And 2 days later, she had quit her job in Washington, D.C., and she was in Alton, Illinois. And I took her down to the board to meet Mr. Ewing so he could see that there were qualified teachers. And so we did get the kindergarten start. She organized the kindergarten. Had to do an awful lot. If you would just know, they made her do family visits of every black family that had age-appropriate students. Cannot name, because I have really forgotten some of this stuff, all of the requirements that were put before us. But we were successful. And we got our kindergarten at Dunbar School. But all the kids from all over town had to go to that one school. And there was no transportation or anything, you know. After Naomi, I guess it was about 6 months, and things had settled down to being kind of just a normal thing. And she received requests to come back to work. And she had quit, you know. Anyway, and she did. After we found Mrs. Mason. She was a very outstanding lady in this community, older lady at that time. But she was just such a lovely lady. She was the wife of a former minister of Union Baptist Church. So Mrs. Mason became the kindergarten teacher. The NAACP we, at that time, Young Turks, as they call those groups, we were not happy with the placid kind of way the NAACP was approaching things through, and we were all active through the churches, but as it was, it seemed to us that most that was happening was just going from church to church, singing and having programs, and they would bring an NAACP officer in once a year for a special, now they have a banquet, but this was just a church kind of meeting. And most of us were involved in church, and we liked church, and we felt that the efforts through NAACP, as in other, at that time just New York and places like that, was primarily through the church. And so the school issue became acute, and we kind of organized ourselves as a committee. And it happened that they, sometimes we say made the mistake of appointing me as chairman of the education committee. So we proceeded to organize as a committee, because we couldn't do it through the whole NAACP, because some of the older people, when I say older, I don't mean just years, I meant, their attitudes were such that they didn't want to cause any problems. Well, we thought we had a problem and that we wanted to remedy the problem. And so the national office came out, and they formally organized us as a committee, formally. And we were kind of a branch of the national office. That worked quite well, because we were sort of free to do what we felt we should do within the scope of NAACP's direction, because we were directly connected with the national office, and they always knew exactly what we were doing, and we didn't break any rules or anything, like that. So, but gradually the churches, the True Church House of Prayer to All Nations, that's what I'm saying. That church, of course, Allen Chapel, originally, we really could not count on the church community. Individuals, yes, but we really couldn't. That only developed many years later, truthfully. But there were very outstanding ministers, and what's now Webster Temple, because Reverend Webster was sympathetic. And so we were trying our very best to get an opportunity for the children to simply, in our children's case, cut across the golf course like our white neighbors' children did, who were their best friends 2 doors away, who spent all of their play hours in our house and yard. In fact, I was talking to the businessman who was one of them the other day about that. And they would just go across the golf course. We lived on Salute Street right there by the golf course, and go to school. But the kids that they played with every day of their lives and ate with and did everything together, they had to either walk to Lovejoy School, and this is by this time, this is what my older children, they'd have to walk over to Middletown, to what you call Mexico, to Lovejoy School, or walk up Salute Street to the bus line you know, and ride around town. So, as their parents had done, because that's what happened. When I went to school here in the 6th grade, we caught a streetcar at Salute Street, and it took an hour going and coming to get us out to Delmar School. Delmar School had been a white school, and the crowding of schools and so forth. That year, which was 1927, they let black kids go to that school, and they took the white kids out and put them somewhere else. So we would ride an hour to get to school. If you missed a streetcar, or if you didn't have your nickel, then you walked to North Alton, over through the brickyard, and of course, kid-like, we had all these little shortcuts through folks' property and stuff, but we would have to walk out to North Alton to Delmar School on Delmar Street Avenue. So, if you've experienced that, and then you see your children experiencing the same thing, you don't have to be hit across the head to wake up and say this cannot continue. And the alternative is sending your kids out of town to school, which was not the answer. So anyway, we started our efforts. Some of us had already been involved, and we started the formal efforts for desegregation through this education committee. And it was absolutely nothing but an NAACP activity. There were meetings, and then there was a swell of support that came, and people were, if I would get on the telephone, and this is an experience I'm related, at 2 o'clock, and say we're going to have a mass meeting, someone's coming in from New York, we'll have a mass meeting, or East St. Louis, Attorney Jones in East St. Louis, in the beginning, he was very helpful and active, and he was the NAACP representative. And I'd say, we'd get on the telephone at like I'm saying, at 2 o'clock. By 7:30, we would have the 300 people at the YWCA. These people they really were ready. They really were. And among those who seemed to be more proactive was the people who had come from the South looking for more freedom. And they got here and found the same thing that they had left in Mississippi and Kentucky or wherever they were from. And it was very frustrating. They thought they were finding a better way for their children. And they, especially on the subject of schools, they really, because, in schools, the black schools were having old raggedy books that they get new books for the white schools, and then when they get old and raggedy, then Dunbar and Douglas and the black school children would get them. Just that symbol of negativism was enough to drive people out of their minds. And as I was saying, that's where the strong support was. Many of the old citizens, I don't mean old in years, but people who had a house and maybe a car, and they go to church every Sunday, that steady kind of people. They just didn't want any problems, and they knew this was a subject that would cause problems from the opposing community, from the white community. And so they weren't quite sure. And the people and the teachers were so frightened. There was so much pressure on the schools. And but these citizens, as I started to tell you, rallied. And Mr. Elijah Conley, who was our neighbor, and his wife, Violet, had a very large family. Elijah was brought here with his brothers from Dayton, Ohio, because they were among the few people in the United States who knew how to lay streets. And they laid all of these streets in Alton. That's how the Conleys happened to be in Alton. And among their family was one of their sons who was physically challenged, extremely so, extremely so. He could only navigate on all fours, drag part of his body, and I mean, it was extreme, extreme. And they refused to give him the same kind of at-home teaching that the white handicapped students received. He could not have that. So he hadn't gone to school. I'm trying to think how old he was during this period of time. I don't want to be held responsible, but I just want to give you a picture. He was at least 10 years old or something like that. You know, he was a big little boy. And of course, his mother and father wanted home training for him because it was available in the school system, and it was denied. All right. And of course, that was enough to stir a family. And they call him Lige. I'm trying to keep from saying Lige. Elijah and Tillman, my children's father, Tillman Wilson, they'd stand out in the yard day after day after day, talking and trying to plan and figure what they could do. You know, Tillman concerned about our kids having, Brother Everett and Tillman, our older kids, having to go all the way across town to school, and his concern about his older kids also, because having to go so far across town, and at the same time, this one son having to be at home all the time and not being able to have any education, whatever, any more than he could have just absorbed, you know. So, they just really decided, these men, we just have to do something about this. And so that, it grew, you know, and we'd have meetings, and then we'd get the advice from the national office and to make it appropriate. They'd send people in to live with Tillman and me. June Shagaloff was secretary to Thurgood Marshall, and she would come and live with us. And I'd pound the typewriter all night long, and she would advise us and help us, you know, to know what was appropriate and legal, till we got to the point where we really were ready for a suit. But before that, you really have to have, a lot of things have to happen before that to know what you're doing. And so we learned all of those kinds of things. And in the meantime, this was coming to the fore by the time we started, I guess. Well, I never heard of anybody else doing it when we first started. We were actually, so far as public knowledge is concerned, we were the first. There are others who have had more. They had, in other communities, they had the education community behind them. And so they had more. We were just peons, you know, just ordinary citizens. And we did not know what we know now. And some of us got ourselves into school and learned what everybody else knows. But we did not know at that time the value of publicity and so forth. we were so busy doing, and the documenting that we did it, we were doing it for the office. You know, we were not doing it for us. We didn't realize the value of that kind of thing. Now see, and of course the dominant part of the community knew it. So there are not pictures, and the Post-Dispatch, however, was sort of in our corner, and they had one of their executives, a Mr. Dilliard, whom you may know, some of you may know, would write small articles in the Post. And the New York Times, when things became very ugly, and there were crosses burned in front of Elijah and Violet's house and in front of our house, and things like that was happening. And Tillman was running, and up in the park, up in Salute Park, Tillman was running. That man had put on big heavy boots, and he went from cross to cross and stamped those crosses out with his feet. I wish I'd kept those shoes. I wish I had kept those burnt shoes. He stamped out 3 crosses by himself. What happened was that we are in the state of Illinois. Everything we did it by Illinois state laws. That's the difference in what we did and were doing and what was happening later in the South. That's the difference. Because we had the state of Illinois laws behind us. And the national office took that approach. And we, of course, now this is farther along than I was just talking a while ago. We stopped all money. We were the first to do that. We stopped all education money legally. And it didn't take long. That ended, and the suit became what they call moot. I'll never forget this as long as I live. We were on our way to court. I'm pregnant out to here. And things were just so terrible. Oh, so terrible. And when we got, I can't even remember, I really can't remember all of this stuff because it's so painful, so painful. When we got to court, Attorney Byrd, who was the second in command under Thurgood Marshall, Attorney Byrd, also a distant relative. He's a distant Johnston relative, we discovered, he and I discovered. Anyway, when we went into court, the first thing, Attorney Byrd came back to us and said, the case is moot. Well, of course, you know, we didn't know what he was talking about, but anyway, he said, the Board of Education has capitulated. And that was the end of the case. Now, there were people, our strategy was those persons, like who were officers in NAACP, those of us who were considered the leaders or whatever, we were not in black and white on the case. It was the people I alluded to. Well, of course, Elijah was, because of his son. And let's see, 2 Patterson families, that I remember. The Kirk Roberson family, and others. I'm ashamed I shouldn't have mentioned anybody when I can't remember, but they were the primary, and these are the people I always give the credit to, because these were the people who were able to really put their names and whatever on the line. But we had to keep the people, we had to be free enough to move if, for instance, anybody, well, anyway, part of the strategy, that was the strategy at that time of the national office. Brown versus whatever was after our case. But our case, and I have heard, especially teachers, say that, you know, like the school board just decided. They had a meeting and they decided. Immediately, I guess after the school thing, it was intensified. And as you were asking the question, I was thinking about time. And I'm thinking of John, my youngest son, who's 49. I became pregnant. He was in arms when we were working with the theaters. The Grand Theater, which is still there, you know, it's not. The Grand Theater, the Temple Theater on Broadway, halfway up Broadway, and the Princess. Well, we had experiences in both, I mean, that are worth recording, at the Princess and the Grand. Our family went to the movies, and we went to the Grand Theater. We decided we were not going upstairs where black people were relegated to go. And we sat downstairs in the middle of the theater, and they came and asked us to move. And so Tillman said, "Oh, we're enjoying the movie," like he didn't know what they were talking about. And he said, "There." So and the man says, the usher says, "Yes, but you're supposed to sit upstairs." He was trying to say it nice. And Tillman was so good at this kind of stuff. And he said, "Oh, we're comfortable. We're comfortable." Tillman, I just see the man standing up over us, you know. Tillman says, we're comfortable, just like you didn't know it. And he says, "Yes, but you're supposed to sit upstairs." Well, you know, we weren't budging. So he went back, and the manager came. And by that time, the manager was not as polite. And Tillman wasn't as polite. And anybody knowing him knew that he could be impolite. And so the manager was so angry. You know what he did? Turned the lights on and discontinued the movie altogether. No movie. And the people had to leave the movie house. And we did too. But we came back. When we went back the next few days, there was no incident at all. No. We had all these kids lined up again. And we came back to the movie. And it was a movie that we wanted to see, I don't remember. And, but they didn't ask us to move that second time. That was the end of segregation at the Grand Theater. We were the first to use the Gandhi approach, the peaceful approach, no matter what the other guy did. We were the first to do that. And I was taught that in East St. Louis. You know, they act like that's something that just happened in 1960. Tillman, he worked at Small Arms during the war. He was drafted, and he went through the first few stages, but they released him. And so he worked in St. Louis. He was always, we built our house, and it turned out, pretty nice. So people were always, his father was a builder, and people were always asking him to do things, and that grew into a business. Tillman, during the war, he worked in St. Louis at Small Arms, which was a result of his suing Olin Matheson. And Olin Matheson had the contract for the St. Louis factory. As a result of the suit, the Alton black employees, several of them, there was about 10, I guess, they worked at Small Arms in St. Louis. And of course, Olin that was counted as their employees. We were attempting to get, after the war, to get them to hire people of all colors. And I was taking groups of people down there to make application regularly. And I was dared by someone who was handling applications, and we had a confrontation. But you just have to stay calm. So I had stayed calm, and I was taking people down there in a very peaceful manner every day. See, when you talk about this kind of stuff, it's hard to tell because it's not once in a while. The schools, we marched these students day after day after day after day. We were marching these streets and sitting in the hallways teaching these children, these black children, when we were doing sit-ins and things, with people standing over our heads with terrible things, terrible things. Anyway, but we had to be cool and peaceful and prayerful. That's what we had to do. Tillman, well, he worked for himself for a while. Nevertheless, he was working for himself doing the school case. All of his jobs, like if he had a contract to build a house for you, then all of that money was held up. It was everything. If he was in the midst of building something, he could not get his money. It was just, everything was just cut down. The banks are the ones that closed down the money, and there was no money except, as I told you, and the YWCA would hire Tillman to do their work, and he built camp out in the camp. Was that Talahi? Yeah. He built whatever they needed, like little cabins or whatever. They were very helpful. In the early 40s, the black women could not swim or belong to the athletic program at the Y. And I had been on every committee there was at the Y. I was a member of the board, but I couldn't swim. I was on the board of directors. If you can imagine what that was like. And there again, I wanted my kids, we were learning to swim out at Wood Station, and not me, but their father was taking them out there, and these puddles and things. And, I wanted them to have some lessons. We went round and around about that at the Y. Well, the executive director never heard of such a thing. She had taken this job in this town, but she didn't know the town was like that. And oh, it was so difficult for her. It was so difficult for her. I didn't want to jeopardize her job because of the kind of person she was. She didn't want to do anything, you know, that would cause her to leave or to be fired. Well, the long and short of it is that I didn't know anything to do but write a detailed letter to New York, to the head of the YWCA. And I just, on a personal way, I explained my concern for not being able to learn to swim, although I was on the board of directors. And I had been a member of the membership, I had been a chairman of membership committee. I've been chairman of 3 different committees. And that I was president of Eliza Williams Club, and that we were a group of women who cared for the Y, but we wanted to be full participants. And asked them, what should I do? Well, they sent somebody out straight from the office, and it was just a matter, if you have the kind of organization where some of the people who participate can't do such and such a thing, then you're not a YWCA, and we have to revoke your credentials. And that took care of that. Not that quickly, but it did take care of it. Just like the men who worked so hard and have worked so hard in this respect, and like my children's father, it affected their personality and their health. This wonderful human being just deteriorated. He couldn't stand it. You know, people had mental problems. That pressure is just unmentionable that black people are going through and still going through. Except, some of the young people now, they take it out in another way. They're just mad at the world and mad at themselves. They turn on themselves, with drugs and fighting and stuff like that, where we channeled ours in that direction, still trying to be good citizens. And in all of these training sessions and everything, we were reminded always, and we reminded others, that we're doing this not only just for yourself, but you're doing it for the white community also, because in order to keep us down, they have to stand still and put their foot on your neck. They can't progress either. And God, we were doing it through a religious Christian point of view. And I don't like to say Christian because there were Jewish people involved too. Some of our very dear supporters, came from the white community also. And some of them who were connected, some of the women whose husbands were business people or school people and all, who objected to what we were doing and were so adamant against us. But, members of their families were not. And they would, give us a $10 bill and say, don't, say who gave it to, and they'd take out membership in NAACP, but don't put their name down. And that kind of thing went on. So when you're talking about this kind of thing, you are talking community. And it may not be ideal, but it is community, because without the people who were here from the South, I'll say, I don't like to say it like that, but that's where that strength that I felt came from. And without some, the white, Caucasian community who knew what was right and was willing, it would take a week to tell all of these stories. There are people whose companies, white people, who were openly supportive to us, who were on our committees and who were chairman of groups and very, very openly protective of what they felt was freedom. And they were transferred, kicked upstairs, given bigger jobs in New Jersey or New York and places. Those kinds of, with us, it was a matter of, like, Tillman and I went 1 year without income. Now, it's hard to tell that, and I don't always tell it, because there's no way for anybody in today's world to know how a family of 5 people could live a year without a penny. I don't say without a penny, because if he fixed somebody's steps or something, he made a little cash, and that's the way we live. Naturally, our parents, mine, my mother, and his mother and father, would help us with food. My relatives out in the country, my uncle particularly, was not active or anything, but he'd give me stuff that he'd raise. In the wintertime, he'd go out and he had turnips buried. That's the only place I've seen that. And he'd go and dig out in this turnip mound, and give me turnips and things. There was a grocer in our neighborhood, Joe Leedy, had a grocery store on Salu and Humbert Street, and he knew everything that was happening. We had never bought any groceries on credit, ever. That's something I've never done, except during that period of time. And Mr. Leedy said, as long as I have a grocery store, don't want your family to be hungry. And anything you want to buy, you may buy it. And you'll pay for it when all of this is over and Tillman is back at work. And we didn't push it too far. We did buy some things sometimes, but we didn't push it too far. Also, where Schwegel's is on 9th Street? You remember the grocery store that was there before Schwegel's? The Wagner grocery store on 9th Street, they also, through a friend who was a customer there, got the word to us that we could open an account there. They didn't say it like that because they were a little, but they got the word to me that I could open a charge account there. So there were good people, and the Lord, you know how things work out. The Lord provides when you're doing what you're supposed to do. You might go through very difficult things, but you'll have those markers that show you if when you're doubting whether you're doing the right thing or but there will be those markers. There will be those markers. So I don't ever remember that we were actually hungry. It was a struggle, but we were not actually hungry. And my children say they thought we were well-to-do because they always, I did a lot of sewing and all that kind of stuff, but within style. They were always in style. And so they had that reputation. The stuff came out of Goodwill. I would buy coats. I'd buy a man's coat, rip it up, turn it wrong side out. You've got a new piece of fabric. Got a new piece of fabric. And those kinds of things. And if the style, and I'll never forget, if the style was in order to keep them from going, the boys, they were doing it again. It's stylish again. These patches, leather patches. And I'd sew Everett, I'll never forget it. He was so dressed up with till he had, and he wore that coat, and the coat had been given to me by one of these friends I'm talking about, where the guy was a lawyer, and he had worn holes. But it was a cashmere jacket, girl. I took that jacket, and I went to Goodwill, and I got old piece of leather. I don't know where I got that leather. Anyway, and I sewed this on. Everett was so proud. Great big teenager too. He had his picture taken at school for the yearbook. And he had his picture taken like this. He was so proud. And so they laugh about it, the kids laugh about it. How they felt so like, they thought we were well to do. Anyway, but and that always made Tillman and I feel good. Our city, Alton, Illinois, has that reputation. Going back, the town, the effect of the Civil War being so close to a war state, and so many people moving back and forth, and the prison that released many of the people whose ideas, and they became the city fathers. They became the business people. They became the people who made the decisions. And then as people come along, they have all of us do this, we follow the pattern that's set before us. And we think that's correct. And in these these river towns, where we have allowed what we consider the negative side of our population to make the decisions. And if you'll notice, even now, what's happening, we are losing the strength of our community to whom? Other smaller communities. We're being swallowed practically. And 50 years from now, we'll be, Alton. And it happened to Alton historically, and St. Louis took over. Alton was the primary city. But businesses, really outstanding businesses, and I've had first-hand contact with international business heads who say when they come here to see about their company, they have never, in all of the companies they never see as much prejudice as they do when they come to Alton. It's different from the Southern prejudice. It's different because it's so insidious and so subtle, but so determined. Look at our newspaper. When you see groups of working, any place there's money, you do not see. You might see a little brown face stuck back in the back somewhere. If it's money, you will not see black participation. It's a pattern that's been set, and as long, and I guess our newspaper has to print whatever is given to them to print. But I used to keep, that's the reason my house is running over with all these clippings and all this junk. I lost a lot of them in the flood last July. But I kept clippings of businesses who were celebrating years of operation, of certain kinds of school activities and so forth, where the people are being paid to do a good job because they are, I hate to use that ugly word, qualified, because that's a discriminatory word, a word that people have used to keep us where we belong in their estimation. So I don't like that word qualified, but I don't know any other word to use either, because we are talking about, I'm talking about who people who are supposed to be in this job. If they apply for it, you take for granted they are, quote, qualified. You're not going to apply to be an engineer when you have an associate degree in general science, and so in this community, we have these what they call they call them glass barriers, but they are stronger than glass, you know, and we have to, when we educate our families, and they are trained, and you teach them to be good citizens, then you have to send them somewhere else because they can't practice what they know here. Can you imagine my daughter being the head of the library in Alton? No, I don't think so. Could you imagine Thomas Carver, who designed, he was head of the committee, their engineering committee, for the designing of the computerized system for the Atlanta airport? Could you imagine him doing that out here at this little airport? Could you? We can't be presidents easily. In some instances, things we have to admit that some things have improved, but you're ever conscious of that limitation because you have that unseen barrier that's in our community. And we love our community, some of us, and we've done sit-in, at least I've done. I'm doing my life sit-in right here because I do, when I could be so much more comfortable. You know, I really could be. But if everybody's going to run, then we don't have much left. And so it is a very deep thing, and it has to do with the history of slavery and the effect that slavery has had on the people in this community, and particularly historically the people who make the decisions. And in our community, traditionally, it seems to me that our businesses have set the tone. We did not have, think how young our colleges are. That was another effort that a lot of us had to get involved in because we had no schools of higher learning. And we were just drifting around. Only business people, industrial people, are the only people with any power or any know-how. And here was a whole, and we didn't know how ignorant we were until we'd go somewhere else. And we'd see it. You could see it. Or if others would come into our community, and they're just amazed at how backward we are. But otherwise, you know, we're just loping along because it's home. It's home. And somehow we've got to find a way to stop the hemorrhaging of our mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual life out of this little historic town. Because I think it can be saved. I certainly disagree with the steps being taken, making it what they call a bedroom community. I think we should have more than bedrooms to offer. And I praise our two primary educational institutions, especially Lewis and Clark. It is offering us some leadership in preparing people for the present and for the future. And it is one of the oases. And those of us who were instrumental in organizing SIU, and of course that was just before Lewis and Clark, we knew we had to get a school of higher education in this community. It's the only answer. We need about 2 more. But that's the only answer for all the segments. But it certainly affects the non-white population as well as the white population, because that is an area, there are limitations and problems there, just like there are everywhere else. When you are working or studying in a school of higher learning, the atmosphere is just different. The limitations are there so far as as ethnic background is concerned. But you can deal with it. It's not quite, I don't know how to put it into words. And we have to, those of us who are well-wishing people of all colors, we need to really be actively supporting our schools of higher learning. Human beings should not be separated because of racial background.